Good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads, episode 97, Friday, March 18th, 2022. Great show today. In between series, we just finished up our series on customer discovery. That was a wonderful one. Going on next to early stage funding next week. But this week, last catch-ups on the COVID news for the state of Michigan. After that, I'll be joined by a representative from U of M's M-Heal program. She was on the show when we were doing our education series earlier on. Aman Tahir will be with us shortly, talking about an external design review that they're holding, and they're looking for your help. We'll talk about that momentarily. After that, it's FDA guidance updates. As you know, the FDA issues guidance documents, and we haven't caught up on those in quite a while. So we're going to bring some to bear that are going to be of interest to many of you. And we'll get to those in just a little bit. But first, COVID metrics and vaccine distribution from healthdata.gov. We're just tracking this for the state of Michigan as we make our way out of this Omicron wave, just to make sure we've got all that data for posterity. In terms of testing, the positivity rate now down below 5% from a high above 30%. The deaths starting to drop in the state of Michigan. The hospitalizations dropping very quickly after a false peak back in December. A new graphic. You would have thought the CDC wouldn't have created any new graphics at this point, but they are now tracking COVID-19 community level by county. And so with the green being low levels of COVID and orange being high, in the state of Michigan, the only place where they're considering COVID to be high is sort of those north and east counties in the state. Now, this graphic has not been updated. They seem to have removed this one, which was state trends compared to the winter 20 to 21 peak. But that was a nice graphic while they had it there. Here's the national version, which they continue to update. And as you can see, cases, hospitalizations, deaths down well below the 50%, more around the 20 or 25% mark, versus the baseline of winter 20 to 21. So it's great to see those numbers dropping. The local hospitals are emptying out. There's only 15 people left at Michigan Medicine with COVID, 4 in the ICU, 2 on ventilators. Spectrum has stopped tracking this data. Henry Ford Health System COVID-19 hospitalizations down to 34 inpatients and only 5 ventilated at this point. So really great numbers. We're glad to see those coming down. We'll just continue to track it as these hospitalizations bottom out. And then we'll probably turn our attention looking back as data comes in about what has happened over the last 2 years. We'll certainly be talking about that, and we'll look forward to bringing you that news as time permits. Well, next up, she's back. Aman Tahir is with us again today from M-Heal. And as you recall, Aman was with us on the one of the shows for our higher education series. She made a big splash talking about the program from her perspective as she studies biomedical engineering at the University of Michigan. But she's also a participant in U of M's M-Heal program, and she joins us today to talk about what they're calling their external design review. Aman, welcome back.
Hi, Gene. How are you?
It's great to see you. I'm doing well. Thanks for being with us.
Sure.
So tell us a little bit about M-Heal. I know you might have mentioned it on the last show, but you're actually looking for community involvement here. And we wanted to give you a chance to talk about the program and also about what you're looking for.
Yeah, so M-Heal is a global health engineering design organization, and we have 11 project teams that each work with a different community around the world to help develop solutions for their healthcare issues. So we're having our external design review on April 9th, and basically all of our teams are going to present the progress that they made over the year. And we're looking for people to be panelists and judges, basically giving them feedback and helping them bring their project further along. So that's where you all come in, and we're looking for people to be panelists. And if you can't be panelists, then at least come as a guest. And this is an in-person event.
That's really cool. And we've got a graphic here, I think, that we can bring up of the design review. And if you want to get the link there, I love this. You can just point your camera at the screen. I'm on. You turned me on to this. I'm going to start using this on all of our slides where we have to communicate a complex
Yeah.
URL. If you want to RSVP or you want to learn more, this is the external design review, April 9th, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Folks from the community with expertise. I guess tell us a little bit more about what we're going to see at this design review, and also who you're looking for, what kinds of people you'd like to reach out and make contact.
Yeah, so our team specifically have requested like people in R&D engineering, anyone in the healthcare field or global health experts specifically to be panelists, but we would still love to have like anyone with to come and be guests and even be a panelist. That wouldn't be an issue. And then basically teams will be presenting their progress over the years, and they have pre-prepared like a list of questions which they want feedback on, and the judges will get that beforehand, and they'll have time to like prepare their answers as well. And then after they watch the presentation, they can give real-time feedback.
That's great. Can you give us any sort of a sense of what kinds of projects MHeal is working on? I know it has to do with global health. It has to do with developing nations, low resource settings. What are some examples of maybe a cross-section of projects that you guys are working on?
Yeah, so a lot of our teams do work like in the Latin American community. So for example, we have Project Mesa, who works to make portable gynecological exam tables for the mobile clinics in the area. We also have, for example, Team Flow. They work out of Ghana. They work to basically develop IV administration devices that will work for that community. And then we also have, for example, like neonatal asphyxia project that they work to make a device that applies hypothermia therapy to help mitigate the effects of asphyxia in neonates. And they've actually been nominated. They're in the running for the People's Choice Award for the Rice 360 design competition right now. So that's really exciting. But yeah, that's just 3 teams, but we have 11 of them.
That's very cool. Yeah, so April 9th, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. You can scan those codes there with your phone to find your way in. If we can get that back up to full screen, there they are. Is there a website if people are maybe not quite that tech savvy that they can go to find out more about the external design review?
I believe that is the learn more link. It should be the website. But our website is mheal.engine.umich.edu, and it'll be on there. And you can always like email Jean and connect us, and I can send you more information. And if you know like people, you yourself are not in the area, but you know of people that are and that would like be interested in doing something like this, please reach out and help us like connect each other to the right people so we can get the right people for our teams to have feedback.
Great chance to see what these students are working on and what they're really bringing to settings all across the world. I mean, I think it's what's so cool. This isn't just a theoretical thing for all of you. It's you're practically doing it. And you're doing it over multiple generations and multiple iterations, and the students come in and go. It's a part of their experience. That's great. Aman, any last thoughts for us?
No, that's all. Would love and appreciate seeing as many as people as possible at the event. So.
That's awesome, and I'll certainly be there, and we'll look forward to anyone else who can come, follow those links, and join us. Thanks for being here, Aman.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Well, that's great. I love seeing the community come out for things like that, and hopefully you can make it. Well, this is the time to mention that for once, this show is actually pre-recorded. When you're listening to this, I will actually be out of town on a small retreat, and so we're sorry we can't be in person today, but Aman and I are live together today, and so we're having fun here. But next up, if you do have questions about anything you've heard today, you can always email them to us, info@intobeing.com. You can reach out on the website form at intobeing.com. Or just follow up on a future show. We're happy to answer any questions, especially about this next topic, which is FDA guidance updates. As you know, the FDA often issues guidances. Sure, the legislation is out there, and at some level you can say, well, what FDA's expectations are clear from the legislation, but let's be honest, often they're not. The actual how do I walk this? How do I get this product to market? How do I get it through the clearance process? Is something that requires guidance. And the folks like us at Into Being, we can come help you with that. But the FDA recognizes that there's a deficit there. they write guidances as processes and programs and other approaches change to try to make their expectations on the community clearer. And so we appreciate that. And it's important to every now and then touch in on those and find out what FDA is saying. So today we're going to cover a number of FDA guidances and try to give you a flavor for them, ones that have been issued recently or are in draft recently. So we'll start here. These are some of the draft ones. We're borrowing a play out of our friends at MHeal, their playbook, and giving you that 2D barcode right there that you can scan if you don't want to type in that URL. But that'll take you to a page, something like this, draft guidance documents. There's a whole lot of them sorted by issued date. And as you can see, we're not going to touch on all of these by any stretch of the imagination. We're picking out some that are perhaps of more interest to those of us in the community. But the first one we'll start with is this, the transition plan for medical devices that fall within enforcement policies issued during the coronavirus pandemic, or rather the public health emergency. And if you recall, a couple of years ago now, the FDA said, you know what, we're gonna loosen up the restrictions on some types of devices. We're gonna make it easier. These are not necessarily emergency use authorizations. They're places where the FDA has said, yeah, these device types exist, and maybe we're going to make it easier to get them to market. Maybe we're going to make it easier to use them off-label. You can follow that link again if you'd like a link to this document. But we're going to walk through it really briefly right here. Devices that are affected by this guidance. So if you're a company or you know a company that is currently selling remote digital pathology devices, imaging systems, non-invasive fetal and maternal monitoring devices, telethermographic systems, things that are going to measure temperature, digital health devices for treating psychiatric disorders. Interestingly enough, that was on the list. ECMO devices and cardiopulmonary bypass devices, ventilators and accessories and other respiratory devices, no surprise there, as well as remote ophthalmic assessment and monitoring devices, infusion pumps and accessories, clinical electronic thermometers, face masks, barrier face coverings, face shields, surgical masks and respirators, gowns, other apparel and gloves, sterilizers, disinfectant devices, and air purifiers, as well as non-invasive remote monitoring devices used to support patient monitoring. All of these devices had allowances made during the public health emergency. Also, modifications to FDA-cleared molecular influenza and RSV. Here's what FDA says. Given the duration of the COVID-19 pandemic and the need to safeguard the public health in a post-pandemic environment, FDA is proposing a 180-day transition period that will begin on the implementation date and end on the date that the guidances in List 1 are withdrawn. So FDA is trying to give about a half a year for folks to make this transition. Now, there's two ways it can happen. One, when the guidance is issued and 180 days passes, or when the public health emergency expires. So there's two different ways this could occur, but long story short, you've got about a half a year when everything comes into play. This is still a draft guidance, so things could still change. But FDA looks to 3 phases to occur. The first phase is if you're selling under this kind of an allowance. Phase 1 is you'd better start thinking about doing adverse event reporting, something that you would have been exempted from under that allowance. Phase 2 has to do with reports of corrections and removals, another exemption that you would have had if you were selling under this. And if you're planning to distribute the devices, it's time to start following registration and listing requirements for ongoing sales. By the time phase 3 hits, that's where everything comes back to bear. Part 820 comes back to bear, as well as a few other requirements. So, as an overview, you've got 180 days in 3 phases when this process gets put into place. Now, there are some details If a manufacturer does not intend to distribute its device after the withdrawal of the guidances, there are a few things you have to do to make sure that you're in compliance. You can read about those at this link, which you can find through what we just shared. Single-use, non-life supporting devices that were distributed, they can be used by the end user, even as this process winds down. Reusable, non-life supporting devices that were distributed before the withdrawal, they can either be restored by the manufacturer to the previously FDA cleared or approved version of the device, or their labeling can accurately describe the product features and regulatory status. For example, this product is no longer FDA cleared or has never been FDA cleared. Reusable life-supporting devices are going to have to be returned to their previously cleared state, or their labeling needs to be changed to reflect their status. So we're not seeing anything here about recalls, but we are seeing as much as labeling changes and recognition that the device is no longer or has never been cleared. Well, closely related to that are devices that were granted FDA's emergency use authorization. You can get the link right there to this document that we'll be reviewing. And FDA in this case would really like to know from those of you who have emergency use authorizations, information regarding whether or not you intend to submit a marketing submission to continue distributing their product after the termination date of the EUA. Here are some device types that definitely received emergency use authorizations: anesthesia gas machines, portable oxygen generators, direct patient interface respiratory gas humidifiers, high flow humidified oxygen delivery devices, ventilators of many sorts, and tubing connectors for co-venting. So if you were in one of those or you have an emergency use authorization, hopefully you're already talking to the FDA about whether you intend to seek marketing authorization. If you don't, we'll have to get out of the business, but if you do, it'd be good to be talking with them as soon as possible. They're interested in things like this: the estimated number of devices currently that are in the US distribution. They're interested in the benefit risk plan that you may have. Yes, that's going to be your responsibility for disposition of already distributed products in the event of a negative decision on the marketing submission. So in other words, if FDA gives you clearance, you can keep your devices out there, but if they don't, they need to know ahead of time how you're going to pull those devices off the market. So it's not a guaranteed shoo-in that you're going to be able to keep those devices out there, and it may be your responsibility to pull them off. There's going to need to be a process for notifying patients, users, etc. And there needs to be a process and timeline for restoring the devices to whatever the previous status was. There also needs to be a plan, an explanation of the plan for addressing already distributed product in the event of a positive decision, because things are still going to need to change, like labeling or components or notifying the users of this positive but nevertheless change that will have occurred. So you've got to be ready for both of those, and the EUA has put perhaps a larger burden on folks than just the changes that were made as we looked in the previous document. Well, FDA's enforcement policy for devices with a marketing submission that's under review by the FDA realizes it's going to take time for manufacturers, especially non-traditional ones, to adjust their operations. And they're not going to worry too much about distribution within the scope of this guidance after the termination date, where the manufacturer has a submission out to FDA. They're saying, hey, FDA, we want to get clearance for this. So they're not going to jump on top of you and say, well, you haven't gotten cleared yet. You are prohibited from distributing. Their intention is to let you continue to distribute until the final resolution of your marketing submission. So if it's negative, you would then have to stop selling and make changes. If it's positive, you'd have to make whatever changes are necessary while you continue to sell. But if you don't intend to continue distribution after the EUA termination date, well, there's a few things you need to think about. It's sort of like what we just read before. Single-use devices, if they're going to be consumed by the end user, they're still distributed. You can still use them. Reusable devices, they need their labeling changed or they need to be restored to their previously cleared status. Life-supporting devices, restored to their previous status, or accurate description of change in the regulatory status. And in addition here, in vitro diagnostic devices that were distributed before the EUA's termination remain distributed and are used for no more than 2 years after an EUA termination date or until the expiration date, whichever is less. So if you have an in vitro diagnostic device, you actually get to keep it out there for a couple of years. Well, what if it's time to discontinue distribution of a device? If you need to discontinue distribution on the EUA termination date, if you haven't submitted a required marketing submission, then you're going to have to discontinue distribution. Or on the date that you receive a negative decision on your marketing submission. So in either of those two cases, it's time to discontinue distribution. Of course, if you do submit an application for clearance, you get to keep distributing until the FDA comes to a decision. So they're being as nice as they can about it. Probably the worst case a company can be in is if they get a negative decision on a clearance and they've been distributing, they've kept distributing, and then they find themselves in a position where they're going to have to do a discontinue distribution and withdrawal from the market in some way. That would be the hardest thing for a company to come up against. Well, that's EUAs and other allowances. The third guidance we're going to look at, a lot of you will be interested in this one, content of pre-market submissions for device software functions. And this is interesting because FDA has given guidance on how to think about software functions when it comes to 510Ks and de novos and PMAs and other submission forms. Here's what the introduction says. It's intended to provide information regarding the recommended documentation that sponsors should include in pre-market submissions for FDA's evaluation of the safety and effectiveness of device software functions. What do I need to put in a 510K, for example, so that FDA can review it when it comes to software functions? Now, as you know from listening to this show previously, software can be a device. It can meet the definition of a device all by itself. It doesn't need to have a true device, a physical device associated with it. But it's still a little ambiguous. What do I have to put in when it comes to my 510K submission or my de novo? Well, first thing to say is that there's other guidances on this. This is not the only guidance on the subject. FDA has at least these other 6 that can be looked at, but these are all older ones. And the one that we're looking at now is a more recent guidance. But if you're in this business and you're looking at device software functions for FDA submission, make sure you check out these other 6 guidances. Also, these standards, it's not a complete list and it's subject to change, but these ANSI standards are ones that the FDA expects you to be looking at. So make sure that you are if you're engaged in this business. Now let's take a quick look at what the guidance is intended to cover. Firmware, things that control medical devices. Standalone software applications that still count as SAMD or software as a medical device. Software that's intended to be operated on general purpose computing platforms. Or dedicated hardware and software medical devices, as well as accessories to medical devices when those accessories contain or are composed of software. So if it's got software in it and it's not a health and wellness device and it's not a electronic patient record or something that you can say isn't a medical device, it's very likely going to be covered by this during your submission to FDA. The guidance applies to all sorts of submissions to FDA, pre-market notifications, de novo classification requests, pre-market approval applications, investigational device exemptions, humanitarian device exemptions, and biologics license applications. So it kind of runs the gamut here. And if you've got software, this is a guidance for you. Now, there's two levels of documentation that FDA expects for software compliance. There's two things they're looking for. And sometimes it's called basic, and sometimes it's called enhanced. Sometimes they want basic documentation. Sometimes they want enhanced documentation. That sounds scary. Oh no, what's the enhanced documentation? Well, the good news is that both of them require mostly the same things. Enhanced, well, it requires more. But here's what the definition of enhanced is. The device is a constituent part of a combination product. So if you have software as a part of a combination product, sorry, you're going with enhanced documentation. Or if the device is intended to test blood donations for transfusion-transmitted infections, or it's used to determine the donor and the recipient compatibility, or blood establishment computer software, it's enhanced documentation. Or if the device is classified as Class 3. Also, if a failure or latent flaw of the device software functions could present a probable risk of death or serious injury, either to a patient, user of the device, or others in the environment of use, these risks should be assessed prior to implementation of the risk control measures. You should consider the risks in the context of the device's intended use, the direct and indirect impacts to safety, treatment and/or diagnosis, and other relevant considerations. If you fit into any of those categories, then you require enhanced documentation. So what does this mean? Let's find out what enhanced documentation is. First of all, the commonalities. There's a documentation level evaluation. This is really typical for FDA. They say, we need you to tell us which of these categories you fall into. And so the FDA is asking the very same thing here. They're saying, tell us which basic or enhanced documentation level you fall into. Okay, so we do that. Then a software description. This is what you might expect. We're going to describe the software, its functions, and the things that go into it. Then the system and software architecture design chart. You've heard us talk about software development for FDA before. You know that architecture is a big part of it that's not typical to many device developments that aren't based on software. Architecture is critical to say how the software is going to be built, not just what was built, but how are you going to put it together, what tools are you going to use. It's part of understanding the control over the software. There needs to be a risk management file. That shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who's been around medical device submissions, as well as a software requirement specification. What in detail does the software have to do, and how is it going to, how are those requirements going to be outlined? Also, a revision level history. This is similar to what you expect out of a design history file for a medical device. The revision level history lists some of the major changes that have been made to the software and what was implemented, as well as unresolved anomalies. So what are the bugs that are still latent in the software? FDA wants to know about those. And this list is common for both basic and enhanced software submissions. You need all these elements, whichever one you're doing. Now, what's the difference? What is different between basic and enhanced documentation? Well, first of all, the software design specification isn't even required for basic software. You get to skip that, for basic documentation, I should say. The software development and maintenance practices need to be there for both, but you need more complete configuration and maintenance plans for the enhanced version. You can just summarize it for the basic version. This is telling FDA, how are you going about your development process? And how are you going to maintain the software after it's on the market? They want to know what that ongoing maintenance looks like. And they'll deal with a little bit less of that if they've asked for basic documentation. Lastly, software testing as a part of verification and validation. Well, you're not going to get away from verification and validation, but you can just give a summary of many parts of your verification and validation for the basic documentation. But for unit testing, integration testing, and system level testing, you have to provide the protocols and their results for enhanced documentation. In other words, they want to see basically all of your testing for enhanced, but only a portion of it for basic and a summary for basic. So that's where they're asking for more details. Now this eye chart, I'm not going to go into great detail on, but this is just an example of one of the kinds of things that you'll find in the rest of the guidance. If you're saying to yourself, how do I create an architecture that's going to make FDA happy? Well, here's an example architecture that they find acceptable. And there's many, many other examples like that inside of this guidance. So if you're a software team or you know a software team that's going through and wants to know what do we have to start creating for FDA for our submission, 510K, de novo, PMA, or many other types, this is a place to start. This is some of the unique things that you're going to need to be creating for that submission. Now, don't lose sight of the fact that all the other things that need to go into a 510K or a de novo or a PMA all need to be there as well. And if you've got questions about this or anything else, we're happy to talk to you. You can reach us at intobeing.com and just fill out our contact form. We're happy to talk with you about some of the other aspects. But hopefully this gives you enough of an index to this guidance that you could start looking at it, start getting some examples directly from FDA. It is a draft guidance, but nevertheless, we expect to see something very much like it released in the near future. And it will become, if not the law of the land, at least a pretty good roadmap to how FDA is thinking. Well, the next one, and this one is near and dear to my heart, assessing the credibility of computational modeling and simulation in medical device submissions. I remember one time we made a 510K submission to the FDA, and we sent along a model. We had both a physical model as well as CAD models and finite element models. And the agency in their review said, is this model validated? Because they had asked for a model, and so we wanted to provide one. But we had no way to validate the models that we were giving to FDA. Now, in the end, they just waved their hand and said, oh, that's fine. And they went ahead and approved or cleared the device without a validated model. They just didn't ask for it anymore. Well, we were very relieved, and that was great. But it shines a light on this issue. You can create cool models. This is true beyond finite element analysis and other things like that, which are often a focus of something like this guidance. You can create awesome models on the computer. But are those models valid? Do they actually tell you the truth? You hear on the news that something has been modeled and models predict X, Y, or Z. And then you wait a few months and you discover that X, Y, and Z just completely didn't happen. What do we say about that model? Was that model useful? Was it not useful? Well, we needed something to make a guess based on, but it certainly wasn't validated. And that's the concern that FDA has when it comes to computational models being submitted as evidence for a medical device clearance. So here's some guidance, and it all focuses around this one word, which is credibility. The question is, if you're going to submit data to the agency that's short of, let's say, clinical data or bench data looking at physical things, is the model credible? Now, how do you evaluate that? And we have here yet another eye chart, and we're just going to go in a little bit of detail on it because we don't necessarily have time to go through the whole document. But what I want you to understand and think about here, if we zoom into this graphic, is the first question FDA wants to know is, what is the question that you're trying to answer with your model? What is the question of interest? For example, is the device resistant to fatigue fracture under anticipated worst-case radial loading conditions? Well, if I was making a model that was capable of evaluating that question, then a model might have credibility. But I'm not hoping to build a model that can answer every possible question. It's just not possible. So the first question FDA has is, what question are you trying to answer? If we don't understand what that is, we can't evaluate your model. The next question is, what is the context of use? And I'm sorry, it appears to be getting cut off there on the screen, but the context of use For example, we just want to know what the worst case device size is for fatigue fracture. We'll then test the devices on the bench. In other words, we just want to use this model to kind of zoom in on an area, but then we'll actually do physical testing. That's the context. So we've limited the scope first by defining what question we're asking. Then we've limited the scope by saying, well, here's where we'll use the model, and here's where we'll use physical testing. If we zoom back in again and we assess the model risk, what are the consequences if our model is wrong in some way? What's the consequence of our decision? The severity of a possible harm. This sounds like traditional risk analysis, and in a lot of ways it is. What influence does the model have on our decisions? What choices will we make or not make based on what the model tells us? And we need to understand that in order to move to step 4, which is that we want to identify the credibility evidence to be collected. So examples might be code verification results. We might need to verify the code in some ways. If we're using a mesh, as many CAD models do, we might need to know if the mesh actually converges or diverges explicitly for any context of use. So if this model will break outside of a certain context of use, then we're not going to trust it for verification and validation. Calibration results, validation under benchtop conditions. You see, this is really a generic version of a problem that we've talked about many times. We've heard about all sorts of applications where modeling can be done, and this is of specific interest to the artificial intelligence and machine learning community, who, as on a previous show, our friend Ken Spencer came on and said, you know, we notice that there are problems in the work that we do with the type of models that are put out there in the field by artificial intelligence companies. They degrade over time. Well, this is a more local example of the same phenomena. If you can validate something within boundaries, you're in pretty good shape. It'll always do the same thing within those boundaries. But when you take it outside of those boundaries, you don't have the same assurance. You don't have the same credibility. And so FDA is basically saying, we need to bound this. We need to bound this somehow so that we can trust the results that you're coming out with. Going in deeper again, the credibility factors, software quality assurance, goodness of fit. You're diving in deeper, asking, do we really understand the limitations? There's a whole list of those that we won't go into great detail on. But if this is something that you're doing, building models for FDA, for your clearance, for somebody else's clearance, hope you'll look at this one. There's a prospective adequacy assessment. Now, this is also near and dear to my heart, and I know you say it's really weird, Gene, why would such esoteric things be near and dear to your heart? I've spent a lot of my career in the field of diagnostics, especially early on, and it turns out that it's really, really easy to find a fit between a data set and whatever testing you choose to do on it. Oh, you can find some kind of fit. Well, up until you bring new data to bear. And then you don't really know what you have anymore. And this happens so many times in the world of diagnostics. It's a common question we have to ask companies that are coming to us with diagnostic capabilities and diagnostic systems. Well, it's true here of trying to predict the future with computer models in general. You need to do a prospective, not a retrospective analysis on the data, because FDA wants to see that it works for new data as well. It's also a good time to submit a pre-submission to receive FDA's feedback on your proposed plan, then to execute the studies that you're in agreement with them on, and to provide post-study adequacy assessments. So what you can see with this topic, we're really doing what is almost a mini 510K just as a part of figuring out whether our metrics are credible, whether what we're building for models are credible. And so it's really, really important. FDA is shining a light on this, as they should, because models can look great. They can tell us all sorts of fun things that make us think we know the future. But they're really saying, no, you don't necessarily. Let's put boundaries around it enough so that we have an assurance. Now, that assurance is not absolute. That assurance is by no means absolute. And in fact, FDA, in one of their examples in this guidance document, notes how that you can have credibility goals. You can actually say, well, we're looking for a low, a medium, or a high credibility goal out of each of these things. So you want to agree with the agency on what your credibility goal is for the particular part of the metric that you're looking at. They're not looking for absolute assurance, but they want to be in agreement with you, and they want you to be in agreement with them on what your goal is for how credible a given part of your model is. So that's a little bit on credibility for computer models. I hope you enjoyed that one. The next one we're looking at today, this one, this is final medical device guidances. So there's a link there. Oops, we didn't get a 2D barcode. Sorry about that. You'll find a whole bunch at the address we just had up there. But the ones that we're going to look at today start with this one, de novo classification requests, the effect on FDA review clock and goals. A lot of you may have questions about how the de novo clock works. And frankly, how does the FDA clock work in general? Always a great question that many folks have interest in. But here's what we're going to say about this today. This is a released guidance. This is a final guidance. So this is FDA's current thinking on the topic. This is going to cover the different FDA actions that may be taken on de novo requests. Remember that a de novo request is when you can't claim substantial equivalence to a predicate device, but you don't qualify for a true Class 3 pre-market authorization. You're in between. FDA says this isn't high risk, but we do need to weigh this device on its merits. We need to weigh it on the merits of safety and efficacy of the device itself, not on the basis of substantial equivalence. So what can FDA do when you submit a de novo request? What are the effects each action has on the MDUFA 4 goals? MDUFA is the Medical Device User Fee Act. That's how they get their money. And this goes through fiscal year 2022. And what are the different industry actions that may be taken on de novo requests? What can you do in response to FDA's responses? Well, so when FDA receives a de novo classification request, they can issue an order granting it. Well, that would be lovely. It doesn't always happen that way, but if they come back and say granted, you're done. That's a wonderful place to be. They can issue an order declining it, and that's a sad place to be. Or they can issue a request for additional information, which frankly is probably where you're going to find yourself. A granting order is a letter issued to the requester stating that FDA has determined that the device meets the criteria for classification either into Class 1 or Class 2. A decline order, no easy way to say it. It's where they tell you that you didn't get your de novo, it's not eligible for it, or you haven't demonstrated what's requested. An additional information request is usually an email with an attachment of deficiencies. FDA issues a request for additional information when the de novo request lacks the information necessary. And the cool part is the AI request. It stops the FDA clock. So for them, that's wonderful. For you, that's not, because now you're talking to your board, you're talking to your investors, and you're saying, yes, we're underway with FDA. The minute you get that AI request, their clock is stopped. It's back in your court. Now, their goals are that the user fee payment happens at submission. The acceptance review of are we going to review this de novo happens within 15 calendar days of the receipt of the submission. And a decision, accept, decline, or additional information, should happen within 150 FDA days. And the FDA feels that they've missed the bar if they go beyond 180 days. Now, what can you do in response to these decisions? Well, it's pretty simple. You can either respond to their additional information request, or you can withdraw the de novo. It's really as simple as that. And so within these options, your goal is to get back to that additional information request as quickly as possible. because that's what's going to keep FDA's clock moving and get you to a decision as quickly as you can. So for those of you who are interested in submitting a de novo or are in process on that, hopefully that clarifies what your options are when you're in stream for a de novo application. Well, last up is this. If you don't know what a unique device identification is, the UDI came into being within the last 10 years, and it's become mandatory for all medical devices in the US. It's really a barcode. We just got into barcodes ourselves. We happen to like them. It's composed of a few different parts, and it's important to understand what information is being communicated in a UDI. It's often an overlooked part of device development. As you're going through the device development process, you know you've got to get your requirements and your user needs and your intended use, and you've got to get your device design, you've got to go through design controls, you've got to do verification and validation. All of these things are becoming better understood by the development community. Well, there are some things that people often forget. They often forget that they have to develop their packaging, for example. They have to develop their packaging to not fall apart and compromise the sterility of the device. Oftentimes, companies will delay to create labeling that tracks with their requirements. And a part of that labeling these days is the unique device identifier, which is composed of a device identifier and a production identifier. Let's talk about those. The device identifier, it's a mandatory fixed portion of a UDI that identifies the specific version or model of a device and the labeler of that device. In other words, FDA wants anyone to be able to go up to a device and find out what it is, what version and model it is, and who made it. They want that traceability to be right there, scannable. And of course, these days we know that you can scan just about anything with your phone as well as a barcode reader. A production identifier, which is also part of a UDI, is defined as a conditional or variable portion of it that identifies one or more of the lot or batch, the serial number, the expiration date, the date a specific device was manufactured. And there's other requirements in certain instances, such as a distinct identification code. And UDIs, you don't just make these up, nor does FDA make these up. That's important to recognize. UDIs have to be issued under a system operated by an FDA-accredited issuing agency. So you don't just sit down one day and say, here's my labeling, oh, I need a UDI, and a half hour later, boom, there it is. You actually have to go out to a third-party agency who's been accredited by FDA, generate that UDI, and they then are able to track that. It has to be presented in two forms on the device label and the device packages. It's got to be in plain text, and it also has to be in automatic identification and data capture, or AIDC, barcode technology. And so it looks like this. You have easily readable plain text format there at the bottom. The number is down there. That UDI number has a specific meaning. And then in AIDC form, a barcode above. That goes with the other label information that's also required, things that you have to have, including who the manufacturer is, their name and address, the expiry date, the lot number, and so forth. But the UDI is here to stay. It's something you have to have on your devices, all your devices. And if you have any more questions about that, feel free to make contact, reach out, and we'll look forward to telling you more about UDIs. Those are some of the guidances that are most useful, most cross-cutting. But you have the links now to all of the draft and recently issued FDA guidances. So don't hesitate to take a look. Don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions. And if you have any questions about today's specific show, feel free to reach out at info@intobeing.com or in the contact form on our website, intobeing.com, or ask it on an upcoming show. We're always happy to go back to previous topics and answer your questions when we get to the Q&A portion. So feel free to reach out on that. Let me tell you what's upcoming. Next week, we start early stage funding. We will be back live with you, and I will be joined by Denise Graves of the Michigan Economic Development Corporation. She will be kicking off our early stage funding series. We'll be talking about all the things you need to understand when it comes to getting early stage funding, especially in the state of Michigan. But more generically, we'll be talking about what do companies need to be thinking about? What do they need to be including in their pitch decks? How should they be considering this process? All that and more starting next week. Well, that's the end of MedTech Crossroads for today. Hope you had a wonderful day. Thanks for being with us. We'll look forward to seeing you next week.